Okay, folks, we are going to continue on in the chapter Economics and Politics. Again, we'll start on page 370. And I want to start out talking about definitions of the economy and to put a little bit of frame of reference on a few things here. So let's start with the definition. And I'm going to segue to the whiteboard. So on page 370, I'm going to simplify this. We want to think about the economy. See the definition: the social institution that that organizes a society's production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. Right. So let's talk about that. So we're going to put production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. Now, something I did not mention in the last video, what we're going to do in looking at the social institution of the economy is focus on it as patterns of human behavior, right? That's what a social institution is, patterns of human behavior that are, significant in society, So we're not going to talk about the stock market, the rate of the dollar, those kinds of things. We want to think about the economy in terms of the social institution, the human behavior, the social component of the economy, okay? And kind of connect those two. And you'll see how we're going to do that more in this lecture here. So this is going to be a simplified definition, okay? This production, distribution, and consumption. I'm going to show you some work that I have done in grad school centered around this. So my work as a sociologist stems from some work I did some research I did in Mexico, and I think I've mentioned that in class a couple times. But when I get to this chapter, and actually the next two chapters, this is where really I cut my teeth as a sociologist, basically, where I developed my capacity as a sociologist. Okay, it's a little long ago when I did that research. It's been about 25 years ago or so, but I think you'll find it interesting, and I'll do that as a separate lecture here later on. But this is a simplified definition, and so what we want to start to think about is what is the type of work that people do. Okay, do you work in production? Do you work in distribution? Do you work in consumption? Now, again, this is a basic definition of the economy. Now, what we also want to talk about is economic activity, okay? And we're going to start connecting some dots here, okay? So, economic activity, we'll put this up here. Hopefully you can see that. Yeah, activity. So we want to talk about tertiary sector, secondary sector, and primary sector. Now, it's an important point to note here that these don't necessarily go together, okay? These don't necessarily go together. When we think about the type of work that people do in the economy, this goes back to sociocultural evolution. And primary sector is agricultural work. Make sure you capture this in your notes. This is agricultural-based work. This is industrial, manufacturing, secondary sector work. This is in your book on page, I believe, 372. Yeah, this is on page 372. Make sure you go to 372 and capture some of these notes. Again, agriculture-based work, industrial, manufacturing, construction. Sometimes we refer to this as blue-collar work. And then tertiary sector is service-oriented activity. And think of this as people working with people. So education, healthcare, retail, that's also in the tertiary sector. Another important point I'd like to note is that one sector is not necessarily better than the other. So human societies were agricultural, and then this traces along that sociocultural evolution, diagram that we looked at. Humans then discover and innovate, because that's what humans do. They discover and innovate in terms of industrialization, and this became a critical part of the economy. And then more recent, we see the information age. Maybe digital technology could also, factor into this. Okay, and some of that is the tertiary sector. Okay. Now we're going to look at this, how it breaks out in the United States in just a moment. What I also want to draw to your attention, and we'll elaborate on this, is the different geographical significance of the economy. We don't just have a local economy. We have local, we have regional, we have state, we have national, and we have international or global. Now, what we're going to do, this is something I would used to do in class to kind of spell this out and draw these connections. Again, this is my background in sociology, but what I'm going to try to get you to think about, I'm probably doing an assignment on this. How do these things start to connect, right? So what I mean by not having exclusively a local economy, for example, one of the few places that people are going right now are grocery stores. Well, where does that food come from? It's not all from Owensboro. And so, there are lots of different dynamics here of economic activity. So, how far up does this go? Are there international dynamics? What percent of products at Walmart come from outside the United States? About 60%. And a lot of those are from where? China, right? So what happens when there is a global pandemic? So, the kinds of things that we're experiencing in Owensboro about being shut down, and even in the state of Kentucky about people staying at home, think about the magnitude, the economic impact of that, not just locally, but people are shut down all across the state, all across the United States, all across the world. This is, really something in the next year to 2 years that's going to play out. It's pretty significant. The economic impact, again, it's such an important part of our society, not just locally, but globally. And that's where we're moving into, right? The next chapter is global stratification. You'll see how these things connect. But again, part of what we're going to do is trace how these different types of economic activity, these different aspects of the economy, how they are significant locally, regionally, state, etc., right? Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is go back to the presentation, and let's look at this right here. Oh, not me. This right here. Okay? Now, this is in your book. Let me tell you which page this is on. I believe it's towards the latter part. It's on page 378. Page 378. Now, what you're looking at here is, this is a really important chart, okay? As it looks at changes in the economy in the United States over time. So we're just looking at the United States right now. This is the percent of the total labor force, and the years are across the bottom. This is looking at the changing pattern of work in the United States. The changing pattern of work in the United States over the last 100 years. And you can see back in 1900, about 30%, actually, let me look at this here, about 40% of the population are working in agriculture. That's the green line. Do you see how these correspond to primary sector, secondary sector, and tertiary sector? Now, make sure you hold on for the rest of this lecture, okay? I think you'll find this interesting in terms of understanding the economy. And it's not just a local, state, but an international thing. But one other item, before I go any further, one other item that I will draw to your attention, we're going to elaborate on this in the next chapter, is thinking about development. What role does the economy play in human development, cultural development, economic development? Is economic development human development? Okay. So we'll get back to that in the next chapter. All right. So you can see that now this is percent of the total labor force. There's about 40% of people working in agriculture in the year 1900 in the United States. A lot of people working in agriculture, and a lot of that had to do with people working in farms. Okay. And you can also see about 40% are working in blue-collar occupations. Well, you can see what has happened over time. This is not just by chance. Okay? And here's a question. Let me go full screen. Here's a question for you on these sets of notes. Okay? Write this question out, and I want you to elaborate on this. Now, this chart on page 376 and the text material in the chapter related to this chart, you really want to go back to this to help answer this question. Here's the question, okay? I'm not going to write it down. You got to write it down. All right? Why has the change in work in the United States since 1900 let me backtrack. Let me figure out the wording. Here it is. Ready? Okay. Describe why economic activity has changed since 1900. All right. Now you can modify that question a little bit, but basically what I want you to do, I want you to explain this, right? I want you to explain this. I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail right now. I want you to go to your book, and I want you to explain why this has changed this way. Okay? I mean, it's clear. It's not, up and down. Maybe this is better. It's not up and down over time. There's an obvious trend line here, right? I mean, you could see that with white-collar jobs, I mean, that is what most people in the United States are doing now. And what kind of jobs are white-collar tertiary sector jobs? And I mentioned that already. So fewer people are working in agriculture. I mean, there's less than 5%, I think it's around that in the United States. Less than 5% of the workforce is working in agriculture. Well, do we got enough food? We've got more food now than we had back in 1900. And this is part of the answer to the question. And so there's maybe three parts to this you want to think about. Why has the primary sector, why has the number of people working in the primary sector declined since 1900? Why has the percent of people working in blue collar or the secondary sector declined since 1900? Why has the people working in the white collar jobs in the tertiary sector in this country changed so much since 1900? So we've gone from about 30% of people working in that sector in 1900 to now it's well over 80%. That's a huge change. Why has economic activity changed as much as it has in this way since 1900? That's the question, the set of questions I want you to answer, and a lot of that is in the textbook, okay? All right, so there's that. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so now we are introducing, look here at the bottom, okay? Now we're introducing low-income countries, middle-income countries, and high-income countries, okay? This terminology was actually introduced at the beginning of the semester in Chapter 1. But I didn't go into it much then because I knew we were going to cover this now. Low income, middle income, and high income countries. Now, there are patterns here, and again, that's what we look at in sociology, are patterns, statistical patterns, right? Now, a few things to say about this. And by the way, this slide is in your book, and it is on page, sorry about that, it is on page, I think it's in this chapter. I probably already passed it up. I can almost hear some of you screaming through the video what page this is on. This is back on page 372. Okay? So, but let's point out a few things. So, regardless if you live in a low-income country, a middle-income country, or a high-income country, most people are working in the service sector, okay? Whether it's at low, middle, or high, most people in those societies are working in the service sector. Now, let's be careful again. It doesn't necessarily mean that people make more money in the service sector, okay? That tertiary sector. For example, somebody working at the drive-thru at McDonald's is considered tertiary sector, service sector. Somebody that's a brain surgeon is considered service sector as well. So be careful, not jump to conclusions that most people or that everybody that works in the service sector makes more money than people that work in agriculture or the primary sector. That's not the case. Sometimes you could be working in the primary sector and make a lot more money than somebody working in the tertiary sector, okay? Now, there is a trend here though, right? So more and more the global workforce is moving into that tertiary sector, that service sector, okay? You can see that here. Look at that pattern. But obviously, people that are in high-income countries are more likely to be working in the service sector. Now, not all high incomes have the same amount of income. Some are more wealthier than others. A while ago I said that 80% of people in the United States are working in the service sector. This is, the United States is one of those high-income countries, but not the only one. But this begs the question. Let's address this: which countries are considered high-income countries? That is another question I want you to answer in your notes. Okay? Some countries that you think are high, middle, or low might not actually be high, middle, or low. This is in your textbook, in this chapter. The section on the global economy starts on page 372. I want you to answer those questions. Which countries are considered low-income countries? Which countries are considered middle-income countries? And which countries are considered high-income countries? Now, again, we're focused on the economy. Okay? Now, there's another pattern here. Two more patterns I want to illustrate to you. Notice that middle-income countries are more likely to have people working in the secondary sector doing industrial type work than any other, category. And so that pattern goes like this, doesn't it? Do you see that? So we're not doing people in the United States are not as likely to be working in industrial jobs compared to those people that live in middle-income societies. There's another trend here. Look at those that work in the primary sector. So people in low-income societies are more likely to be working in the primary sector compared to high-income societies. But regardless if it's low, middle, or high, people are more likely to be working in that tertiary sector. So, try to get your mind wrapped around this just a little bit, okay? So, there's this slide, but I'm not going to go into that. That's in the book, and that's part of what you can access to answer the questions that I've posed during this lecture. So I'm going to stop right there, and we're going to continue on. There might be one more. Let me check real quick. There might be one more. No, that's going to be the last lecture for this chapter, I believe. You're also going to have an assignment about government and what's government's role in the economy. And that's going to be asking you to look at capitalism versus socialism, okay? And so you're going to have an assignment on that, but this is going to be the last lecture for this chapter. Now remember, this chapter goes with the next chapter, and that chapter goes with the next chapter, okay? So we're not done talking about the economy. The next chapter we're moving into is global stratification, okay? So again, introducing you to this idea of the economy and the definition of the economy, the economic activity, local, state, national, international dimensions of this, and we'll carry this forward into the next chapter. So keep up the good work. See you soon. Peace.